we move back into our discussion of Romans 9 through 11, of course. And so maybe just a little bit of rehearsal of these chapters would be useful before we jump into chapter 11. As Tom indicated yesterday afternoon, and I certainly agree with the way he introduced the chapters as a whole, the overall point Paul is making, made in chapter 9, verse 6a, has to do with the reliability of God's word and especially his promises to Israel. And all of that is wrapped up in the issue of the gospel, which I identified as the theme of the letter way back when we started this seminar. When was it? A week ago? 10 days ago? That the gospel as the theme of Romans emerges here too, in the sense that, and you remember Romans 1:2, the gospel promised beforehand in the Holy Scriptures. I pointed to that verse and said it's sort of anticipating things to come. Paul is deeply concerned that despite what's happened in salvation history, Israel not responding very well to the gospel, that nevertheless the gospel he preaches is authentically rooted in the Old Testament promises, and that what is now happening in salvation history is in fact quite in keeping with God's promises in the OT. So that's what Paul is generally doing in Romans 9 through 11, constantly bringing the Old Testament itself into the picture. It's interesting statistic, 1/3 of all Paul's Old Testament quotes come in chapters 9 to 11 here. So over 13 letters he wrote, fully 1/3 come in these 3 chapters alone. So very, very dense interaction with Scripture is obviously what Paul is doing, and we can understand why, granted his purposes here. Now, if chapters 9 and 10 in general look at Israel's past, that is, how do we explain her present circumstances? Well, we explain that, number 1, chapter 9, by God's sovereign determination. He calls whom he wills. Those Jews whom he had destined for salvation have come to salvation, but never did God promise that he would destine all Jews to salvation. So again, the fact that so many have not believed in Paul's day is not itself in any way contradictory to what God promised in the OT. Then second, and Tom brought this out very well, of course, you have Israel's culpable failure to believe. And again, here you have this interesting juxtaposition of divine sovereignty, chapter 9, with full human responsibility, chapter 10. These are woven together throughout the Bible in a way that we will never be able quite to understand in this life. But to be faithful to Scripture, one has to maintain both of those. We come to chapter 11 now, in which is, I think this indicates, yes, here we have it. Paul turns to Israel's present situation. 11:1 to 10 is kind of a summary or coming back to where he's been to state what the situation is now in Paul's day, and then Israel's future in 11:11 and following. So look with me in your Bibles at 11:1 through 10. Paul talks about Israel's failure quite a lot in chapter 10. Their failure to believe, to understand, the fact that their zeal for God is not accompanied by knowledge. And when I think about what Paul says of Israel there, I think of John chapter 9 as the greatest biblical illustration of this blindness motif. Here you have a man whom Jesus heals, a man who was born blind. Jesus gives his sight to him. And the Jewish leaders at the time decide to investigate. You remember the story. And they interview this man. He said, well, you can see now, right? And he said, yes. This morning I couldn't see, and now I can. And Jesus did this? He said, yes. And basically they say, no, he couldn't have. He doesn't follow our law. He doesn't follow our tradition. Clearly, he can't be someone through whom God is going to work miracles. And this humble man whose sight has been restored can only say, I'm no theologian, but I know this morning I could not see, and now I can. And Jesus was the difference. So factor that into your theology, Pharisees. Doesn't quite say that. I'm paraphrasing quite considerably here. But that's the tenor of that story, isn't it? The Jewish people so intent on their understanding of the way salvation history was supposed to unfold that they had blinders on. They just couldn't get away from that theology that they had worked out for themselves. And anything that didn't fit, no matter how obviously a work of God, their theology was going to trump that. Let that be a warning to us, too, not to become so rigidly committed to a particular theology that we can't let God break through and surprise us and move us along as we read his word in certain ways. So that's the situation of Israel at the present time. Nevertheless, Paul says, did God reject his people? Verse 1. Absolutely not. He gives himself as evidence. There are faithful Jewish Christians. There is a remnant. Paul talked about the remnant toward the end of chapter 9, and again he sort of comes back now to that and reminds us of the reality of a remnant, just as in Elijah's day, feeling alone, persecuted, rejected even by God, out there in the wilderness by himself. I'm only left, Lord. I'm the only faithful Israelite there is anymore. And God reassures him, no. I've got many others who have not yet capitulated to Baal, and who have not yet fallen into idolatry. So Paul says at the present time, verse 5, a remnant chosen by grace, and if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What passage we looked at yesterday does that remind you of? So one of the things that Tom and I are going to do is test you to see how much you've really taken in during these 2 days. Well, what text does that remind you of? That's a good text, but it's not quite the one I had in mind. So, did I hear 4? Yeah, 4 to 5, where you have the same argument there. Tom explained that. You recall that if it's works, we're in a kind of situation of obligation. Lord, I have worked. You are now obliged to give me salvation. That can never be the case with God, though, because God is always a God of grace, a God who acts freely, who can never be constrained by his creatures. So for Paul, grace and faith go together as two sides of the same coin. If it's grace on God's part, it's faith on our part. Both Luther and Calvin famously compared faith to open hands. That what faith is opening our hands to receive the gift God is seeking to give us. So works operates in a different sphere entirely. And in a seminar sponsored by a Reformation fellowship, it's worthwhile perhaps just emphasizing how central this faith versus works contrast was for Reformation theology in general. And it's under attack in our day from a variety of angles. We don't have time to go into all of that here, but there are a lot of scholars who are questioning that antithesis, but I think it's quite clear in Romans and elsewhere in Paul and the New Testament scriptures. This contrast between faith and works as different routes to get in a relationship with God. So that's the situation in Paul's day. What shall we say then? Verse 7, what the people of Israel so earnestly sought, they did not obtain. On the whole, the people have not attained the promise that God had for them. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. Remember the language of chapter 9, verse 18. Paul actually uses a different Greek verb here behind our English hardened, but the point is the same. That God in his sovereign grace operates to choose those who will belong to him, and in some mysterious, hard to understand way also operates on the dark side, as it were, in hardening humans as well. My wife and Diane are back there more interested in the gecko than in me. I guess this is just the reality you have to deal with here. No water skiers, but geckos to entertain you in case I'm a little boring at that point. So, at any rate, let's move on to 11:11 and following now. Here, Paul turns to the future of Israel. You see, he asks a question again to sort of bring the argument along. Have they, that is the Israelites, stumbled so as to fall beyond recovery? And I take the they there to be Israelites in general, not just the hardened whom he's just been talking about, but generally the Israelites. Have they stumbled so as to fall beyond recovery? Has the last word been said about Israel? That this is going to be the situation? Only a remnant of Jews, a small number coming to salvation in Christ, joining the new covenant people of God, and that's just going to be the way it is. Is there a possibility for recovery? Well, Paul says, yes, there is. And in order to make the point about how that's the case and how it works, I don't think I have a clicker today, so if we could move to the next slide. Gets complicated, and this is one of the places where I should probably have had a handout rather than a PowerPoint. But people always, you're taking photographs of it with your trying to preserve a copyright in this day and age. And people will do this. They'll take photographs of it, and then they'll doctor them and put them on the internet. Look what Dr. Moo was saying. So that's the age we live in, isn't it? I should have had this as a handout for you because there's a lot of detail here. I'll try to go over it so it's clear enough. The general point I'm making is that Paul makes a point several times in verses 11 to verse 32. Basically the same kind of sequence that he describes in different ways with different emphases. But this is how salvation history is unfolding. Let's begin with verses 11 and 12 to set the scenario here. Because of their transgression, their being the Israelites again, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Okay? Their transgression has meant, that's in verse 12. Salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. Now, verse 12. If their transgression, that is the failure of Israelites to believe, that's the fundamental transgression that Paul is accusing them of, unbelief. If their transgression means riches for the world, that is, the Gentile world, that there has been this movement of turning from Jews to Gentiles. And of course, we see that illustrated in the book of Acts on a number of occasions. Paul preaches the good news about Jesus in the synagogue. Some respond, most don't. So Paul basically says, all right, if you don't want to be included in what God's doing, I'm going to turn to the Gentiles. And he preaches to them, often to pretty good response, and so he plants these churches that are mainly Gentile in character. So these steps have already happened. Their transgression has meant riches for the world. And Paul says, in case you missed it the first time, let me say it again. Their loss, their failure has brought riches for the Gentiles. Again, the doors have been opened to the salvation of the Gentiles, partly through Israel's failure to believe, which of course itself has been orchestrated by God. We have to remember, God is not surprised at what's happened. He had determined how this was going to unfold, even if it was a surprise to many based on the Old Testament scriptures. Now, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring? So, riches have come to the world because of Israel's failure. What will be the situation, however, Paul asks, when they will be included again? Their full inclusion, or their fullness, the completion of God's purposes for Israel is what he's talking about here. When that happens, there will be even greater riches. So note 4 key steps here. Israel's failure to believe, number 1, leading to salvation being proclaimed widely among the Gentiles. Step 2 already happened. Step 3, Israel's full inclusion, leading to step 4, even greater riches for the world. Okay, so there you have those 4 basic steps. Again, we see them repeated. Look at verse 15. If their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, you see the same sequence, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So again, 4 steps: Israel's failure, Gentile inclusion, greater inclusion of the Jews, leading to here what Paul calls life from the dead. Let me pause on that last phrase a moment, because it's kind of a linchpin in the way we understand Romans 11. What does life from the dead mean? There are fundamentally 2 options here. First, it could refer to resurrection life, God giving life to our mortal bodies, who are now, those bodies, still sunk in and subject to death. So the focus here could be on the end-time resurrection. On the other hand, life from the dead could simply mean new spiritual life. That, of course, can happen at any time. Paul uses in Romans 6 a phrase very similar to the one he uses here. Now, anticipating just a little bit, if the reference here is to the final resurrection, then Paul would seem to be saying that this full inclusion of Israel is an eschatological end-time event. When that happens, the resurrection of the dead is here, you see. Are you following me? Because one of the key issues we're going to be talking about, relevant to the famous verse 26, Israel being saved, is when is that going to happen? If life from the dead refers to resurrection, then it looks like that's going to happen in the end times. Their inclusion will mean resurrection. But, let me emphasize this again, this phrase need not mean that. It could refer to new spiritual life as well. You know, sometimes you're interpreting passages like this, and you just long for one little phrase or argument that's going to absolutely nail the thing. And sometimes we try to find those even if they're not there. We sort of fudge the evidence a little bit, or we decide not to investigate too carefully lest we find complications we would rather not find. But again, very often what you're going to find is, well, yeah, we've got an argument that might tilt things this way a little bit, but it's by no means something we can pound the nail in on. It's not absolutely conclusive. So that's the case here. All right, Paul goes on in the famous image of the olive tree in 17 to 24. Paul uses this image of an olive tree to make his point, and it's essentially the same point again. He elaborates it a little bit more, makes some points that we're going to want to talk about in a moment. But again, you see the same basic steps. Natural branches are cut off. Israel's failure, you see. Those who belong naturally by birth to this tree. They were the Jews to whom God had given the covenants and the promises. Remember back 9, 4, and 5 at the beginning of Romans 9 through 11. In a sense, all of this stuff was theirs, basically. The promises of God was for them, the Jew first. Go all the way back to 1:16. So these natural branches, nevertheless, have been cut off. Why? Because of unbelief, Paul says. And unnatural branches have been grafted in. Branches that didn't really belong to that olive tree, who were a bit foreign to it. Obviously the Gentiles, you see, who are not the ones who first were the recipients of God's promises. But Paul says natural branches can be grafted back in again. You don't have the fourth step made clear here. But again, we have the first three made very clear. Now, before we get so involved in the theology, we miss the pastoral point Paul is making here, something Tom alluded to briefly yesterday. Let's make sure we realize why he is teaching what he's teaching here. Look at verse 18. I am talking to you Gentiles. Now, some take that to mean all of the audience of Romans was Gentile. I think it's more likely it means he has to say this because now he wants to make clear he's focusing especially on the Gentiles in the church. There are Jews and Gentiles listening to this. Remember Romans being read orally in the context of the Roman Christian community or communities. It seems there were 4 or 5 house churches in Rome. At any rate, I'm talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. What I think Paul is saying is this. He has learned that some of the Gentiles in Rome are using Paul and his Gentile ministry as an excuse for their arrogance and their boasting over Jewish Christians. We can just imagine, Paul, he's apostle to the Gentiles. He's for us. We now are the people that God is really working with. We're the ones that are being saved in significant numbers. You Jews are over. Your history. That's the past, but the present and the future belongs to us. And remember, if indeed the situation is that you have Jewish Christians coming back to Rome after being exiled, finding themselves in a minority and not in leadership anymore, you can just see that whole scenario at work here. So Paul's concerned about their boasting. He makes the same point, as you can see in the text we're looking at here with the olive tree imagery. He tells the unnatural branches, do not be arrogant. Verse 20. Don't be arrogant. Verse 25. I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery so that you may not be conceited. So you see the theme here. Paul is talking about the way God is continuing to be faithful to the Jewish people to stifle any kind of arrogance among the Gentile Christians in Rome. Now, I take it that the olive tree is probably an image for the people of God. The people of God as those people have existed throughout history. Roots in the patriarchs, the promises God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's where this whole enterprise began, with God's initiative. A tree has grown up, and in Paul's day, again, you have natural branches being broken off because of failure to belief, unnatural branches, Gentiles, being brought in. I don't think I need to go through all of this, but let me come to 25 to 26. Actually, I am going through all of this, so who knew? I don't think there's any doubt but that Paul's claim in verse 26a is one of the more controversial in Romans, perhaps one of the more controversial in the New Testament as a whole. In this way, reading NIV again here, in this way all Israel will be saved. understanding that promise is easier if we put it in the context that we've established. We again have that salvation historical sequence in verses 25 and 26. And by the way, note that Paul calls this a mystery, a word he usually uses to describe a truth revealed in Christ that was not clear in the Old Testament scriptures. If a scenario emerges in the Old Testament scriptures about how God would deal with the fulfillment of his promises, it's not absolutely clear, and there are some texts that go different ways, but overall, the pattern, we see this again in Isaiah, as so often for Paul, Isaiah is important. It will be God bringing his people, Israel, back from exile, establishing them in their land, bringing them great prosperity, glory, and wealth. And as a result of that, Gentiles will be stimulated to come in and join with Israel in the worship of this God who is obviously so powerful and blessing his people so abundantly. So if there is a pattern in the OT, and I think it is a general pattern, the sequence again is God saves Israel, and as a result, Gentiles come in. The mystery, then, is that God has, to some degree, reversed that sequence. Paul looks at salvation history in his day. He takes a look around and sees what God is actually doing as the gospel is being proclaimed. Gentiles are streaming in. Jews largely are not. And so Paul looks back at some of these prophetic texts and suggests a kind of reversal. No, it's going to be the Gentiles who will stimulate the obedience and response of the Jews. So the mystery here, Israel experiences a hardening in part. We should be familiar with that by now. Just another way of saying the same thing. 2, the full number of Gentiles has come in, and in this way, all Israel will be saved. Now, I've used double underlining here and at the end of 15 to signal that these are the debated texts. These are the ones that are not clear. When is that going to happen? When will all Israel be saved? What is this life from the dead? So let me approach that, as I often do, by looking at some of the options. The next slide, please. We can get to the next slide. Here we are. I like to work this way. It's the way my mind operates. I'm kind of half German in my background. I'm afraid my Germanic organizational tendencies come out very often, but I'm sorry, you may not work this way, but this is the way I work. What are the options for these two fundamental questions here? How will all Israel be saved? Well, there is no reference to Christ here, is there? There is no reference to faith in Christ here. So maybe all Israel will be saved through the special covenant God entered into with the Jewish people. So we end up with fundamentally in Paul 2 different routes to salvation. Gentiles are saved through the Christ covenant, but Jews continue to experience salvation through their own covenant that God entered into with the Jewish people. This view, sometimes called bi-covenantalism, there's another fancy phrase to memorize and use to all your coworkers and friends and other folks. Bi-covenantalism, that is 2 covenants, you see, has become very popular, particularly since the Holocaust of World War II. There is a widespread recognition that some segments of the church, at least, have been guilty of certain anti-Semitic tendencies in the past. I think that's sometimes been generalized to too great an extent because there have been faithful Christians who avoided anti-Semitism very strongly. But at least in terms of the German situation, the national church, probably not on the whole a believing church, but nevertheless the national church pretty much succumbed to Nazi ideology and was complicit in the slaughter of 6 million Jews. And many Christian leaders and theologians look at that and say, what is there in our Christian teaching that could have led to that could have meant these people compromised in that kind of way? We have to rid any anti-Semitism from the New Testament text. And here's the key point, you see, they go on then to conclude, if we claim that Jews do not have the right to be saved in their own religion, we are being anti-Semitic. You follow the thread of the logic there? So again, there's this widespread tendency to want to absolve Paul and New Testament authors of anti-Semitism in this view by arguing that they can be saved in their own covenant. Now, all of you, I hope at this point, are saying, well, I hope Dr. Moo is not really teaching that. So for all of those out there on YouTube or who are going to quote this, I am not teaching that. I'm describing what some people teach. But for me, and I think for all of us here, we recognize that Romans and Paul and the New Testament are so massively Christological that any thought of salvation apart from Christ is just ridiculous. What has he just said in chapter 10? If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Has he forgotten that when he gets to chapter 11? Should we forget that when we get to chapter 11? Obviously not. So while indeed we have to be careful in engaging with other religions to respect and try to understand people in terms of the faith they have and where they're coming from so that we can more intelligently and powerfully talk about the gospel to them, we shouldn't be cowed into thinking that if we claim Christ is the only way, we are being arrogant, dogmatic, or anti-something. Interestingly, and again, sometimes he doesn't have the best reputation among certain kinds of evangelical Christians. Probably the person who has made this point more strongly and more eloquently than anybody else is Tom Wright, who is just absolutely clear, forthright, and compelling on this particular point. Sometimes we lose perspective in our Christian world. We can say, well, here are my set of beliefs, and it's only people who agree with all of these set of beliefs I have that I'm going to have fellowship with, and I'm going to kind of not have anything to do with others. Well, there are things that Scripture makes clear we have to be committed upon if we want to have true fellowship in Christ. But there are a lot of things that aren't, and we have to remember that someone like, let's say, Tom Schreiner and Doug Moo, Tom Wright is here, a little different than us, yes, but there are people way over here. And it's those people we should be a lot more concerned about. So just, again, a plea for perspective on that kind of point. So this question is a non-starter, I think. How are we saved? In and through Christ, only in and through Christ. The real issue here is, who is this Isreal Paul talks about in verse 26, and when will they be saved? One option, which has had very prominent support throughout the history of the church, Luther and Calvin probably fall here, is that Israel in verse 26 is a way of referring to the entire New Testament people of God, basically the church. So what Paul is saying here is God is going to bring this oscillation between Jews and Gentiles. Jews rejecting, Gentiles coming in, that stimulating Jews to believe, and then Jews in turn bring Gentiles in again. That throughout salvation history, there's going to be this back and forth between Jews and Gentiles, and it is in this way that God is going to bring the entire elect people to salvation. So that all Israel being saved is a way of saying this is how God is working throughout our current history to bring all his elect people to the salvation he has destined for them. I'm not convinced, however, that we can shift the meaning of Israel here. For myself, I think Paul does use Israel to refer to the church in Galatians 6:16. Tom, you agree with that, I think, don't you? No. Where Paul talks about the Israel of God. I take that to be a reference where Paul does take the actual name Israel and apply it to the church. And Tom was going over all those things where Paul does that. Children of God, glory, adoption, and so forth, that Paul brings, in a sense, from Israel and applies them to the church. But I think that's the only verse where he does that. And as far as I can tell, everywhere else in Romans 9 through 11, Israel is an ethnic entity. It's not the church, it's not Gentiles, it's Jewish people. Clearly, that's so in the immediately preceding verse. Israel has experienced the hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles come in. Clearly, Israel here is distinct from the Gentiles. And I think that's how Israel must be being used in verse 26. So in terms of who, I think the reference here is to the Jewish people. Next, then, is the question of when. We can sort of simply plug Jewish Christians into the view I just described. So rather than saying, in this way, all Christians, all the elect, Jew and Gentile elect, will be saved, Paul might be saying, in this way, God is bringing all elect Jews to salvation. That it's this historical process that Paul here is describing in its culmination. So in this view, when is Israel saved? Throughout church history. That's taking place all the time as Jews come to Christ. The other option for the when, is to take this as an end-time eschatological event. Something that happens at the end of history, where there will be a significant turning of Jews to Christ. That's the view I hold. It's the majority view among scholars today. Tom, I think that's the view you hold as well. You see, we've got to be right when we agree, So how can there be any quibble? The majority of scholars today take that view. So then along the way, if I could just back that up, I think it is likely life from the dead, back in verse 15, does refer to resurrection. And if you look at the context here, what is particularly significant to me is the word until in verse 25. A hardening in part has come on Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Now, by far the most natural way to read that is to assume then that this hardening lasts until a certain moment and then is removed. I'm going to speak until the frogs start making noise. You better hope not. But you are assuming and certainly hoping that means I will stop speaking once those frogs start making their noise. You see, that's how we use until, isn't it? Stay there until I meet you, and then we'll go somewhere else, implication. So here, hardening on Israel until the full number of Gentiles comes in, assuming a removal of the hardening and the opening of the door to the salvation Paul is talking about. But that's, you see, a sequence that is related to the end times. Along these lines, I tend to think that verse 26a, where Paul quotes the OT, is a reference to the parousia. Not entirely clear again. The deliverer will come from Zion. Could that be the first coming of Christ? Yes, it could. I think it's slightly more likely to be a reference to the parousia. So to conclude, on my view, Paul tells us that far from having permanently rejected the people of Israel, he still has a plan for them. That plan takes shape especially in the bringing of a significant number of Jews to salvation at the end. How about all Israel? That's, as I thought about that phrase, it's an awkward phrase in both Greek and English. Let's think of something comparable. All Hawaii. Now, I think we would know if we say every person in Hawaii or every Hawaiian. But when we say all Hawaii, I think that's a little unclear just what that means. And I think that's a clue to Paul's usage here. This is an Old Testament phrase. About 50 times in the OT, we have the phrase all Israel used. Very seldom does it refer to every single living Israelite. For instance, in the book of Samuel, we are told that all Israel saw David sin with Bathsheba. Now, maybe they built a massive stadium. Maybe they had YouTube back in those days so they could live stream. But, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. but again, the point is, clearly the Old Testament uses this all Israel in a selective sense or in a representative sense. So I don't take it that Paul here is promising every single Israelite alive when Christ returns will be saved. But I do think he's suggesting the present remnant, which is a pretty small one. There are Jewish Christians in our day, grateful for them, but there aren't a lot of them, we have to admit. Any Jewish Christians here? Kind of make my point a little bit, perhaps, there. That remnant is going to swell in the end days, and in faithfulness to his promises to Israel, God is going to bring a significant number of Jews to salvation. How bold am I feeling? I have to be careful, these people that egg you on. So, all that Romans 8 talks about is this spiritual matter of salvation of many Jews in the end. Obviously, there are a lot of other questions about the future of Israel. Is the land promise still in effect? That's one of the big issues here. I'll just point out, Paul doesn't say anything about the land here. So obviously that's not a matter we can settle in Romans 11. It's going to have to be settled elsewhere. Good, faithful interpreters of Scripture disagree on that one. I myself think that the land promise given to Israel, along the lines that Tom was talking about, so I'm going to put the blame on him, Romans 4:13 has been expanded to the world. It's been universalized. That the promise of land originally made to Israel has now been expanded and universalized to include the entire cosmos as the inheritance of the people of God in the new age. All right, that's Romans 11. We need to move on now to 12 and 13. Tom was mentioning teachers and commentators that ignore 9 through 11. I know those who ignore chapters 12 and following. All this great theology in Romans 1 through 11, boy, let's get our heads around that. Let's stimulate our intellects with all this dogmatic stuff and this practical stuff at the end. Don't need to bother with that. No, Paul has all this here for a reason. The gospel demands response. The good news of God is that Jesus indeed has been established as Lord, dispensing salvation to all who believe, but at the same time, as the Lord, calling on his people to obey him. Remember the phrase obedience and faith all the way back in Romans 1:5. So we don't move away from the gospel when we turn to chapter 12. We're rather talking about the fleshing out of the gospel in the daily life of believers that Paul is vitally concerned about. So we want to do justice to these chapters in fairness to Paul. I'm looking at 12 to 13. 12:1 to 15:13 can be taken as one big chunk of the letter, but it in turn is clearly divided into two parts. 12 to 13, which is very general, talking about a lot of different fundamental issues in Christian ethics. But then 14:1 and following focuses on a single problem in the Roman Christian church. And Tom will be talking about that. I like my inclusios. I try to find them wherever I can. I force the evidence if I need to in order to get them. So you'll have to decide whether you're persuaded or not. But I think this passage, 12 to 13, is framed by reminders of the stage of salvation history in which we find ourselves. Remember our discussion of the 6-act play? Here we come on the stage in Act 5 with the stage of Jesus' work behind us and the stage of the consummation ahead of us. That's where we are located, and that's how Paul is thinking about us. So he talks here in chapter 12, verse 2, about not being conformed to the pattern of this present age. This present age. And you remember our diagram? The new age has been inaugurated, but the old age continues. We Christians are stuck right there in the middle of these warring ages. The new age that has dawned, that has become real in our lives. But the old age all around us that continues to have a threat to us. Paul's saying, don't be conformed to that old age. That's not who you are anymore. That's not where you really live. You're new age people. That's a questionable way of putting things, but I might have to rephrase that to make the point clear. But you see the point. We belong to this new era, let's use that word, that God has inaugurated. And our lives then should conform to it, not to this present age that presses itself on us all around us. And similarly then, at the end of this section, in chapter 13:11, what does Paul say? Understand the present time. Again, it's as if he's saying, remember what act of the play you're in. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber. Our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. It's a phrase that blows some people's minds if they think salvation equals conversion. Our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed? I thought I was saved. Well, to repeat, yes, in some sense we are, but in another sense we're not. That salvation in its culminating effect lies in the future for us. The night's almost over. The day is almost here. Let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let's behave decently as in the daytime. Now, to understand what Paul is doing here, we have to see that he's making, I think, a deliberate play on the word day. Clearly, in the contrast with the nighttime here, there's the idea of the daylight. And traditionally, deeds of evil are associated with the darkness. That's when bad things happen. That's when bad people emerge to do their bad things. So nighttime as opposed to daytime, in that simple, straightforward sense. But I think Paul is also alluding here to the Old Testament teaching about the day of the Lord. The prophets constantly talk about the day of the Lord, the time when God will fulfill his promises. And so when Paul says, let's behave decently as in the day, I think it's not only, make sure you walk in the light, but also conform your lives to that day of the Lord that has already dawned. And so again, the focus on the salvation historical placement is here. All right, I want to talk about several specific things in chapters 12 to 13. Now, first, let me look at a phrase in Romans 12:2 that I think is quite fundamental in getting a sense of Paul's teaching of the Christian life. These are well-known verses, aren't they? Verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world or this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. I think this notion of the renewing of the mind is absolutely basic to leading a successful Christian life. It talks about our very way of thinking being transformed and changed. It's like reprogramming a computer. That we, when we come to Christ, are given a new piece of software. And what we begin doing at that moment when we come to Christ is we begin using that software to reprogram our thinking. You see, one of the fundamental problems I see in the current Christian church is a tendency to be very faithful on certain issues that Christians have heard about and been exposed to, but to live absolutely in a pagan way on a whole set of other issues, where there's maybe not clear, obvious biblical teaching, or where the issues are not prominent in the church. The point of renewing of the mind, you see, is that once our mind is renewed, we take it with us everywhere, and everything that happens to us, every issue we engage with, is brought through the funnel of that renewed mind. It's very well known, of course, that the Jews in Jesus' day tried to ensure absolute, consistent obedience among the Jews of that time by multiplying commandments. You know, we've got to find a commandment for every issue a Jew might face. So you end up with 150 pages in the Talmud about right behavior on the Sabbath. The Old Testament says, don't work on the Sabbath. All right, good enough. What's work? Well, can't throw water out the window on the Sabbath. That might cause something to grow. That's agriculture. That's forbidden. Can you pull a tooth on the Sabbath? Depends how painful and life-threatening it is. On and on and on and on. And the problem with that mentality of multiplying laws, which I think deeply affects the Christian church as well in our day, you could never find enough laws to cover every situation. Think of a lot of the big issues you face in your life. Who should I marry? Where should I live? Which job should I take that's going to be most exalting to Christ and beneficial to me and my family? On and on and on. Where are you going to find a verse in Scripture that tells you what to do in that situation? You're not. You need to be a person who has a being renewed mind that will look at all of reality from the standpoint of Christian principles. So I think this idea of renewing of the mind is absolutely central here. Now, if I could get the next slide, this doesn't mean that there are no commandments that apply to us. There are commandments that apply to us, and we've talked about this. I think Tom and I both would agree they are located in what we might call the law of Christ. And Paul, as we well know, isn't hesitant to issue commands. He'll say to the Corinthians, oh, you think you're being led by the Spirit in doing that? Do not do that. Commandment. So the commandments are there, but they are not the fundamental thing. The fundamental thing is the Spirit working to renew our minds. The commandments are there to let us know when we're getting out of bounds. Because in this life, our minds will never be perfectly renewed. It's like an airliner landing at an airport. This is my scenario, at least. I don't know if it's actually like this or not, but I would rather not know for the sake of my illustration. That airliner is coming into land, and it is being guided by an onboard computer. indicating what should the elevation be, what should the speed be, when do the flaps need to come up. The computer is guiding all of that. Of course, with the 737 MAX, we see what happens when they're not programmed well. It's another story. But in theory, of course, the computer is guiding the plane exactly where it should be going. However, if you've been to an airport, especially at night, you'll know there are a lot of runway lights out there to sort of act as a check on whether the computer is working right. To tell the pilot, oh, getting off course here, we're getting close to those lights. So I think the commandments are sort of like those runway lights. I can't emphasize this point strongly enough. For my teaching at least, you don't take anything else away from you from this weekend of teaching the renewed mind. And what that means is a dedication to read Scripture, hear it taught, fellowship with Christians as means to renew your mind. I sometimes like to say this, and I hope this doesn't get up on YouTube. Probably will. That's okay. I hope they keep it in the context here, though. Your goal as a Christian should be to do away with your Bibles. You should have read them, absorbed them, memorized, understood them so well, the reprogramming of your mind has taken place. You don't even need these anymore. Just like someone who really knows a software program well doesn't need the manual anymore. Now, that's an extreme statement. We always are going to need our Bibles. Please be assured I think that and believe that. But again, this dedication to a long-term process of renewing the mind, and that's the other issue here, long-term. You're not instantly going to have that renewed mind. It's going to be a long process, a dedicated process of using whatever means you can to renew the way you fundamentally think, so that in all areas of life you think and act Christianly. Some specific points now Paul makes. So 12:1-2 is sort of the general overall, okay, here's the fundamental thing you need to be doing, and then that works itself out in certain specifics. So we can to that last slide then. 3-8, Paul talks about the importance of the unity of the body in the midst of the diversity of gifts he gives it. I'm not going to talk much more about that. This passage is parallel in many ways to the more elaborate 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul makes a similar point about one body, many parts that need to cooperate together in order to help that body function well. Verses 9-21 is a kind of rapid-fire listing of different things. There doesn't seem to be any obviously common theme to all of these, but certainly something that stands out right at the beginning is love. My NIV translates, love must be sincere, and that's a fair translation. But in fact, the Greek doesn't require any verb here at all. And this might be more of a heading, the sort of thing you put at the beginning of a chapter or something, sincere love. Tom, in his sermon this morning, which I hope some of you at least were able to hear, fine sermon on a great text, alluded to Philippians 2:1-4, where Paul talks about other regard. Have a regard for others rather than yourselves. A number of scholars, and I find myself among them, like that phrase as a better option perhaps than talking about love. I think love is degraded coinage in our era. It means so many different things. It doesn't have a clear idea to people. We talk about it all the time, but do we really understand anything by it? Whereas I think other regard, that's what love really means. We have regard for others. My brothers and sisters here in church, my neighbors, my work associates, people who live on the far side of the world, whom I might be impacting by my actions and decisions here. Other regard is what Paul is calling on us to do, and he gives us a lot of specific examples of how that works out here, both in the Christian community and in our relationships with the world as well. So you'll see in verses 17 and following, especially, the focus is on how Christians should relate to those outside the church. Quickly, Romans 13. If you could go to the next slide or skip the one we already did. Yeah, here we are. Romans 13, 1 to 7 is sort of thrown into the mix here. I suspect it might be because there were issues in Rome on this matter. For instance, we have evidence that at Rome at about this time, there was a widespread rebellion against the authorities because of taxes. Sound like a familiar story? And that might stimulate what Paul is saying here. I've given the basic structure here, which I think, again, is clear enough, a bit of a A-B structure. So twice Paul says the basic command is to be submissive to the governing authorities. Verse 1, and again verse 5. In each paragraph, he gives us two reasons for that. One, God has established government authorities. Every authority has been established by God. A mind-blowing thought, but that's what Paul seems to be saying. Two, obey the authorities to avoid punishment, because God has ordained governing authorities to reward good and to punish evil. So if you want to avoid being punished by the authorities, do good. The history of the interpretation of this text is basically an attempt to figure out what it doesn't mean. Because people read this text and it seems to provide unqualified demand to submit to a governing authority at any time, in every place, in whatever circumstance. Now, practically in our own lives, we kind of rebel against that. Should I really be complicit in an absolutely evil act the government might require me to do? Is that what this text is saying? But more important than that are many texts in Scripture which encourage disobedience to the governing authorities. Revelation is pretty clear on that, isn't it? Don't succumb to the beast or its mark. So clearly there's got to be something else going on here. And my point is this, not just from a sort of practical standpoint, but in faithfulness to the scope of biblical revelation, I think we are obliged to ask now, Paul, how might you be restricting this? I think he does it in two ways myself. If we could get the next slide. One, and I'm going to skip the first two because I don't think they fit. So let me just go to 3 and 4. Paul calls here on submission, but the submission idea is a general requirement to view ourselves as in a structure where we are subordinate to something or someone else. I'll put it somewhat controversially here to make a point and exaggerate it maybe a bit. To submit doesn't mean to obey. It might not always mean to obey. Just as wives submit to husbands, but do not submit to the husband when that husband orders the wife to do an obviously unchristian act, let's say to harm her children. She recognizes my husband rightly is the one ordered over me in God's providence and arrangement of things. I continue to recognize that relationship, but ultimately God is at the high end of this chain. He's the one ultimately I must obey. So I think when Paul's call to submit to governing authorities, yes, we're to recognize they have this role, they are appointed over us, we shouldn't take that lightly, but that will not necessarily, in my view at least, mean obedience all the time. Two, a very obvious point, I think, is as we read this passage, we come to verse 4. The one in authority is God's servant for your good. They are God's servants. They punish evil and reward good. Now, we we probably, most of us, live under a government that generally does that. But we also know there are many governments that don't act that way, and many occasions when governments don't act that way. I mean, surely Paul knew his Jewish history here, knows what some of the pagan kings did to the people of Israel. Doesn't he remember that the very Lord he serves was unjustly crucified by the Romans? Were they punishing evil and rewarding good when they did that? Surely Paul has to know that, and yet the fact that he can present government here simply in those terms of rewarding good and punishing evil might suggest that he has a sort of implicit qualification here. Submit to the governing authorities when they are acting in accordance with God's providential provision for their service. When they are not, then perhaps there is the right to disobey. This is a very large and significant issue. It affects us to some degree, but it affects our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world in a fundamentally basic way. We have friends who are serving in China right now who are having to make extraordinarily tough decisions about how faithfully to be an ambassador for the gospel in that kind of a context. It's just very, very difficult. One of the things I would suggest is that we as evangelicals need to do a better job of developing a theology of government. It goes beyond Romans 13, obviously. I think we need to work on that a little harder than we have, to be honest, because there are many, many issues there that we face and that our brothers and sisters elsewhere face. Verses 8 to 10 comes back to love. Wait for it. Clusio. With 12, 9 and following. Oh, love, love, love. Love is to be sincere. Let's talk about the government. Now let me come back to love, you see, where again the importance of love as the fulfillment of the law. And then 11 to 14, as we said, wrapping things up with another reminder of the context in salvation history where we find ourselves.